Good evening. I'm Haylee Ficuciello, Senior Correspondent for Englebrook Independent News. Tonight, we bring you a special federal crime report covering major federal prosecutions, convictions, sentencings, and investigations announced throughout the western United States during the closing weeks of May of 2026. Federal authorities have announced significant developments involving fentanyl trafficking organizations, violent robberies, immigration enforcement action, child exploitation investigations, public corruption cases, identity theft schemes, cybercrime operations, and major fraud prosecutions. We begin tonight in Washington state. Federal prosecutors in Seattle announced a 6-year prison sentence for Tavion Mitchell, a Kent resident tied to a large-scale drug trafficking conspiracy responsible for distributing more than 800,000 fentanyl pills nationwide. Authorities seized over 846,000 fentanyl pills, 7 kilograms of fentanyl powder, 7 kilograms of cocaine, 29 firearms, and more than $116,000 in cash. Prosecutors say Mitchell maintained close ties to organization leadership and was involved in planning distribution operations across multiple states. One firearm recovered during the investigation was later linked to 3 separate Seattle area shootings. Also in Washington, Shannon Hartfield was convicted on 17 federal felony charges after prosecutors proved he led a violent robbery crew responsible for targeting marijuana dispensaries, banks, and credit unions throughout the Puget Sound region. Authorities say Hartfield recruited juveniles as young as 14 years old, supplied them with firearms, selected robbery targets, and coordinated escape vehicles. Sentencing is scheduled for August. Federal Judge Mary Derp sentenced Michigan resident Andrew Stephen Otto to 28 years in prison for sexually exploiting and extorting child victims online. Investigators say Otto posed as a teenager to manipulate children into sending explicit images before threatening and coercing them. Federal authorities recovered evidence involving multiple victims and additional child sexual abuse material during the search of Otto's electronic devices. Moving to Oregon, federal prosecutors in Portland announced charges against Alex Miller Eldridge of Lake Oswego. Investigators allege Eldridge sexually exploited minors across several states and at least one foreign country using online communication platforms. Authorities say Eldridge traveled from Hawaii to Pennsylvania to abuse a child victim he met online and later distributed recordings of the abuse. Additional evidence was reportedly discovered during a search of his residence. 6 defendants face federal drug trafficking charges following a major Oregon investigation involving methamphetamine and cocaine distribution. Authorities seized more than 28 pounds of methamphetamine and 6 kilograms of cocaine during a traffic stop connected to the operation. Federal prosecutors say the organization supplied narcotics throughout Oregon, including Portland, Salem, and Bend region. A Woodburn man pled guilty after leaving a voicemail threatening to kill the United States Senator. Federal prosecutors say Donald Loy Smith Jr. threatened to put a bullet in the senator's head. He faces sentencing later this summer. In Boise, Idaho, resident Terry Benjamin Elliger received a sentence of 13 and a half years in federal prison. Authorities say Elliger distributed child pornography through social media communication and made sexually explicit comments involving young children during a conversation with an undercover officer. In one of the most unusual fraud cases announced this month, a federal jury convicted a man whose true identity remained unknown. Prosecutors say the defendant assumed the identity of a California child who died in 1977 and used that identity for more than 2 decades. Authorities say he fraudulently collected nearly $300,000 in government benefits and obtained a U.S. passport using the deceased child's information. In California, federal prosecutors in Los Angeles announced charges against a Philippine national accused of smuggling approximately 500 pounds of cocaine aboard an oil tanker traveling from Ecuador. Authorities say the cocaine was designated for Mexico cartel operatives awaiting offshore. Investigators recovered roughly 227 kilograms of cocaine during the operation. Kenneth Iswaza, the former live-in assistant to an actor Matthew Perry, was sentenced to 41 months in federal prison. Prosecutors say Iswaza repeatedly supplied and injected Perry with ketamine, including doses administered shortly before the actor's death in October of 2023. Federal investigators allege Iswaza attempted to conceal evidence after Perry died. Federal authorities arrest alleged 18th Street gang member Miguel Angel Alvarez. Investigators say Alvarez, a convicted murderer working under a Los Angeles violent intervention program, illegally possessed body armor despite his felony record. Authorities allege Alvarez remained active in gang-related activities after his release from prison. Former Aspiration Board member Joseph Samberger received 14 years in federal prison sentence. Prosecutors say Sandberg orchestrated a fraud scheme involving fabricated financial information and scam business transactions that caused investors loss exceeding $248 million. In Nevada, a Mexican national has been sentenced to 4 years in federal prison after posing as an IRS employee and convincing victims he could obtain large tax refunds through a fictitious government program. Federal prosecutors say the scheme sought nearly $1.8 million from the IRS. A Las Vegas resident, Mohammed Salbi Taraki, pled guilty to exploiting children in his care and possessing hundreds of child sexual abuse materials and videos. Federal prosecutors say Saraki also distributed illegal material throughout social media applications. In Utah, a federal judge sentenced St. George resident John Larson to 10 years in prison. Authorities recovered fentanyl pills, methamphetamine, heroin, marijuana, and distribution material during a traffic stop. Two Salt Lake City residents face federal charges after allegedly helping a handcuffed immigration detainee escape from federal custody. Investigators say the pair used bolt cutters to remove handcuffs and later bragged about the incident on social media. In Arizona, federal prosecutors charge a 19-year-old Arizona man accused of attempting to set fire to an immigration and custom enforcement facility. Authorities say surveillance footage captured him breaking a window, placing a propane tank near the building, and attempting to ignite the structure. Federal prosecutors announced that more than 700 immigration related cases were filed across two separate enforcement weeks in May. The cases include illegally re-entry offenses, alien smuggling operation, transportation offenses, and repeat immigration violators. Two Tuscan men received lengthy federal prison sentencing. Nathan Hint was sentenced to 40 years for producing child sexual abuse material involving multiple victims. Johnny Hammond received 18 years for sexually abusing young children on tribal land. In New Mexico, federal jurors convict Juan Gomez Montiel for coordinating alien smuggling operations that move individuals, including an unaccompanied minor, through New Mexico and Texas. Prosecutors say the operation involved stash houses, guides, and cross-border transportation networks. Three inmates were federally charged after a corrections officer was beaten unconscious and tased during a 22-second attack in the Dona Ana County Detention Center. Authorities say the officer suffered a sustained assault before additional staff intervened. Federal prosecutors announced a guilty plea from Stephen Craig Campbell. Authorities say Campbell spent more than 40 years living under the identity of a deceased man while avoiding prosecution on an attempted murder case dating back to early 1980s. Investigators recovered 57 firearms from his property during the arrest. In Alaska, a Canadian national has been arrested and charged in connection with the Kim Wolf boatnet investigation. Authorities say the operation infected more than 1 million devices worldwide and generated some of the largest denial of service attacks ever recorded. The attacks allegedly caused millions of dollars in losses globally. And finally, in Hawaii, a former Hawaii County's House official was sentenced to nearly 4 years in prison for participating in a bribery scheme involving affordable house agreement valued for more than $11 million. Federal prosecutors say the project generated substantial profits while never delivering the promises housing units. A Kauai resident pled guilty to conspiring to distribute large quantities of fentanyl throughout Hawaii. Federal prosecutors say the cases involve suppliers, distributors, and narcotic trafficking activity centered around Waki area hotels. The defendant faces a mandatory minimum sentence of 10 years in prison. Federal prosecutors across the western United States continue pursuing major cases involving narcotic trafficking, child exploitation, violent crime, organized fraud, immigration offenses, cybercrime, and public corruption. Many of the defendants featured in tonight's report have already received a lengthy prison sentence. Others remain awaiting trial, where they are presumed innocent unless proven guilty in the court of law. For continued coverage of federal investigations, criminal prosecutions, and major court developments from across the nation, stay with Englebrook Independent News. I'm Haylee Ficuciello. Thank you for joining us tonight. Good night.